Somewhere beneath a planetary surface, 200 years before anyone thought to look, it was already waiting, red, and carved into the shape of something that predates human language, a double helix, the exact structure coiled inside every cell of every organism that has ever lived on Earth, stretched into a monument twice the height of a person, standing in the dark of an alien world, broadcasting into the silence. The colonists, who eventually built their homes above it, had no idea what they were living near. They dug mines around it. They went about the ordinary business of surviving on a rock too far from the sun. And underneath all of it, the signal had already started. The red marker in dead space is one of the most debated objects in horror game lore. Players have spent years arguing over it, whether it's the villain or the mechanism of something like salvation, whether it wants humanity dead, or whether it's offering something older and more complicated than simple destruction. Whether the signal it broadcasts outward into the minds of anyone who gets close enough, that low, persistent signal that researchers would spend decades trying to decode, is a warning, an invitation, or something that was never intended to be understood at all. This video is going to work through that question fully, not just by walking through events in chronological order, but by examining what the marker's actual behavior reveals about its purpose across every game, every piece of lore, and every civilization it has touched. This is an interpretation of the Dead Space franchise, an analysis of how the marker's design reflects real patterns in how intelligent minds can be led somewhere devastating by something that looks exactly like hope. By the time we reach the end, the answer to the question in the title will be clear, and it will not be comfortable, because the real horror of the red marker isn't what it destroys, it's what it offers. If something in this deep dive resonates with you, please drop a comment letting me know what connected. Whether it was a detail that recontextualized something, a connection you hadn't made before, or just a moment that stayed with you. You can also throw out a topic suggestion for a future video while you're there. Some of the best ideas on this channel have come straight from the comments, so now get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. Chapter 1. The Shape of a Promise. Before the red marker, there was the black one. It arrived on Earth billions of years before humanity existed, carried inside an asteroid that struck the Yucatan Peninsula with enough force to reshape the climate of the entire planet. The impact left a crater, the Chicxulub crater, and for tens of millions of years, whatever was buried inside it sat undisturbed beneath rock and water, while the species that would eventually find it slowly evolved above. That evolution is worth pausing on. The franchise eventually reveals that the black marker's signal doesn't just wait passively. It guides. It shapes biological development over long periods of time, nudging organisms slowly in the direction of intelligence, toward the kind of mind that could one day notice the signal, understand it, and respond to it. If this is accurate within the lore, then humanity didn't simply discover the black marker. Humanity was, in some meaningful sense, grown toward it, cultivated, shaped over millions of years by a force that needed something specific from its end product. Picture what that implies for a moment. The most ancient alien artifact in this universe didn't fall on Earth by accident. It arrived with a timeline already in mind, and that timeline was patient enough to wait for the right creature to develop, achieve civilization, develop technology, and eventually dig down far enough to find it. In the year 2214, that moment arrived. A geophysicist named Michael Altman was working near the Chicxulub impact site when something in his readings pulled attention downward. The black marker had already been affecting the people of the surrounding region for some time, producing elevated rates of depression, behavioral irregularities, and in certain cases extreme violence. The signal was working before anyone knew what was generating it. Altman led an excavation team to the site. What they pulled from that crater was unlike anything previously documented by human science. An enormous double helix structure, black, covered in symbols that no existing language could approach, generating an electromagnetic field that confounded every instrument they brought with them. The research facility built around the black marker became something close to a controlled catastrophe almost immediately. researchers began experiencing what would later be categorized as marker-induced dementia. Some entered states of manic devotion, some turned violent, some began hearing voices. A meaningful portion of the team developed an obsessive reverence that looked less like scientific inquiry and more like the early formations of a religious experience, something erupting from inside them rather than being reasoned toward from outside. Altman stood at the edge of that pull without fully falling into it. He could observe what was happening to the people around him, watching colleagues he knew and respected begin to deteriorate, some of them crawling toward the marker, some of them weeping with what appeared to be joy. He recognized that whatever this object was, it was not safe. The signal it broadcast was not a gift being offered to humanity. It was something being done to them. When a scientist at the facility injected himself with a compound derived from the marker's encoded instructions and transformed into something that could no longer be called a person, the situation ended any pretense of control. The first necromorph outbreak in human history spread through the compound. By the time the chaos burned itself out, a significant portion of the team was gone. Altman gathered what research he could and did the only thing he believed might contain the damage. He destroyed the facility and sank the black marker back into the depths of the ocean. That decision should have been the end of it. Two men ensured it wasn't. Stevens had been the facility's psychologist. Markov had been the military official overseeing the project. Both had spent enough time in the marker's signal to cross a threshold that Altman never reached. Where Altman perceived danger, they perceived revelation. Where Altman wanted containment, they wanted continuation. When Altman emerged from the disaster as the person who understood the most about what the marker was and what it could do, Stevens and Markov recognized that his credibility and his death could both be used. They killed him. After that, they constructed something extraordinary in its calculated deliberateness. Using Altman's actual broadcasts about the black marker, genuine footage he had recorded to warn the world about what he'd found, they reframed every element of his story. In their version, Altman was a prophet who had received cosmic truth from an alien artifact. His attempts to stop the research became evidence of governmental oppression. His death became martyrdom. The chaos inside the research facility became the first communion of a new faith. The marker itself, the object Altman had risked everything to bury, became the central object of worship for what would grow into the Church of Unitology. There is a real psychological dynamic operating here, and the franchise is drawing from it directly. Throughout history, the study of how cults and movements form has identified a consistent pattern. Founding figures are frequently rewritten after their deaths, their actual complexity stripped away and replaced with a cleaner, more usable story. The martyr becomes more valuable than the living person, because a martyr cannot contradict the narrative being built around them. Altman's genuine skepticism, his documented fear of the marker, his concrete attempts to destroy it, all of that simply ceased to exist in the Church's version of events. What remained was a symbol, and symbols, unlike people, are durable enough to last 3 centuries without asking inconvenient questions. The Church grew because the world was ready for it. Humanity at that period was facing resource crises, social fractures, and a specific kind of existential anxiety that comes from a civilization beginning to sense its own limits. Research in social psychology has identified a pattern called terror management, the way humans construct and commit to belief systems partly as a defense against the awareness of their own death. The knowledge that we will die, that everything we build will eventually end, generates an anxiety that cultural and religious frameworks help contain. Unitology offered something extraordinary in response to that fear: actual, literal, promised transcendence through convergence. The marker's signal, which drove certain people to violence and madness, was reframed not as illness but as preparation. The darkness pressing on their minds was described as the marker getting them ready for the next stage of existence. By the time the events of the first game begin, the Church of Unitology is the largest religious institution in the known universe. Billions of followers, influence embedded throughout every significant branch of human government, 300 years of growth. all built on the death of a man who died trying to prevent exactly this. Now hold that thought, because it matters to the core question of this video. The Church of Unitology was not simply a side effect of the black marker's discovery. It was, in a very precise sense, a function of the marker's design. The signal caused enough dementia to generate chaos. It left behind exactly the kind of people, the ones whose specific psychological profiles made them capable of interpreting what they experienced as divine, to build an institution. And that institution spent 300 years working to spread markers further, to reach more civilizations, to trigger the exact event the marker was always building toward. The marker manufactured the faith that would serve it. That pattern is not coincidental. Recognizing it is the foundation for understanding everything that comes after, because the entire history of the franchise is the same mechanism playing out on a larger and larger scale. The red markers are where the mechanism becomes something you can touch. Chapter 2: What the Signal Hides. 80 years after the black marker was sunk back beneath the ocean, scientists working for what was then called the Sovereign Colonies had studied enough of the recovered data to attempt something that the government framed as a matter of survival. They were going to replicate the marker. Humanity's resource crisis had deepened considerably. The concept of marker-generated energy, of essentially limitless power harvested from an alien source, was far too attractive for a government watching its civilization strain under the weight of expanded colonization and dwindling reserves. The project was described internally as necessity. At the end of the 23rd century, at least 3 copies of the black marker were eventually produced, grown rather than constructed in any conventional sense, their red coloration the result of substituting available human materials for components of the original that researchers couldn't identify or source. The bismuth used to fill those compositional gaps gave the copies a deep red tint that distinguished them from their black predecessor. These were the red markers. Each was sent to a distant, isolated location for testing, one to a planet called Aspera, one to a system near Proxima Centauri. The third, designated Marker 3A, went to a planet called Aegis VII, remote enough that any disaster could theoretically be contained, close enough that the data could still be gathered. The colonies built near these markers were not told what they were living next to. That decision alone is worth examining. The people responsible for this program understood the black marker's history. They had access to what had happened at the Chicxulub research facility. They knew that proximity to the marker produced dementia, violence, and the specific kind of breakdown that preceded necromorph outbreaks. They sent populated colonies there anyway, and they simply didn't tell those colonists what was buried beneath them. The reasoning, from the program's perspective, was likely that a pre-existing population of workers would give the markers a consistent source of data about how humans respond at close range over extended periods. In other words, the colonists were test subjects who hadn't agreed to the experiment. Aegis VII is where we need to slow down, because Aegis VII is where the lore begins to reveal its full structure. Picture the colony in its ordinary moments before the outbreak. A settlement built for resource extraction, functional and unglamorous. The kind of place people end up in when they're willing to accept discomfort in exchange for decent wages. They had families there, routines, relationships. The mine produced materials that mattered. The community was imperfect, but real. Beneath the planet's surface, Marker 3A was broadcasting. Symptoms of dementia began appearing in the colony before the marker was even unearthed. Depression spread through the population at rates that should have triggered medical intervention. Behavioral changes followed. A unitologist engineer named Deacon Abbott had been living in the colony, and as the signal intensified, he began preaching in the public spaces. He told his neighbors that what they were feeling was the marker preparing them, that the darkness pressing on their minds was revelation, that the thoughts of death and meaninglessness bleeding through their daily lives were the marker showing them that ordinary existence was something to be released. Some colonists believed him. Consider what this moment actually reveals about the marker's mechanics. The signal was producing thoughts that, from inside the experience, felt like spiritual insight, growing detachment from daily life, a sense that ordinary concerns no longer mattered. an inexplicable pull towards something vast and undefined. These are symptoms of a specific kind of neurological disruption, but within a particular framework, they can be interpreted as the early signs of enlightenment, and the marker is specifically, deliberately creating the framework alongside the disruption. Research on how belief systems form under conditions of sustained psychological stress has found a pattern worth understanding here. When the brain is under prolonged pressure, when its normal frameworks for making sense of the world are interrupted, it becomes significantly more open to explanatory systems that promise coherence and meaning. The mind in genuine distress actively searches for structure, a signal designed to produce that distress, while simultaneously offering certain individuals visions that seem to confirm a larger cosmic purpose, is doing something very deliberate. This is where the marker starts to look less like a weapon and more like something that hunts. The most effective predators in nature don't simply attack. Many operate through more sophisticated means. Certain parasites alter the behavior of their hosts in ways that benefit the parasite's reproductive cycle without visibly harming the host in the short term. The organism is redirected rather than destroyed, guided toward an outcome that completes someone else's agenda, while the host remains functional and often unaware that anything unusual is happening. The marker operates on a civilizational scale, but the logic is recognizable. The signal drives the majority of minds toward chaos and violence, producing the raw material it needs. A smaller subset of minds, those with the right kind of cognitive architecture, receives a different version of the signal entirely. Not noise, not chaos, something more like purpose. These are the people who become protectors of the marker, builders of markers, architects who keep the object alive and functioning long enough for it to accomplish what it was built for. They aren't broken by the signal, they're aimed by it. Here's the feature of the marker that has generated the most debate among players since the original game. The marker maintains a field around itself, a zone the franchise refers to as dead space, within which the necromorph infection lies dormant. Creatures affected by the contagion cluster at the edges of this field, but cannot enter it actively. And people who shelter within the dead space radius experience relative safety from the creatures surrounding them on all sides. This is where the argument that the marker is trying to protect humanity gets its most compelling evidence. If the marker generates the very conditions that produce necromorphs, why would it simultaneously generate the field that keeps those creatures at bay? The simplest reading is that the field is a safeguard, that whatever intelligence lies behind the marker's design built in a containment mechanism so the outbreak wouldn't overwhelm its own ability to function. That interpretation requires ignoring what the containment actually accomplishes. The necromorphs gathered around a marker's dead space aren't besieging it, they're accumulating near it, drawn by the same signal that created them, held back from the marker's immediate vicinity, not because they're attacking, but because the marker needs the biomass to continue building. Consider what happens in the area surrounding that field. A growing mass of creatures, each one adding more infected organic material to the total, spreading the contagion outward into the wider population, generating more dead tissue that becomes more creatures in turn. The ring of necromorphs around a marker is not a failed siege. It is an assembly line. The marker is waiting for the count to reach a specific threshold. When enough biomass accumulates, the containment drops, the field opens, the gathered creatures converge, and what the franchise calls convergence begins. So the dead space field is not protection for the people inside it. It is quality control for the event the marker is preparing. The biomass has to reach the right density first. The field ensures the system doesn't trigger prematurely, before the conditions for a successful convergence are in place. The marker is being patient for its own purposes, not for yours. This is the first lie the marker tells. It appears to hold back the horror. In practice, it is managing the horror's development toward an optimal outcome. The second lie is more personal, more precise, and it is the one that catches the people the marker needs most. On Aegis VII, as the marker was eventually extracted from the planet's surface and brought aboard the mining vessel known as the USG Ishimura, certain individuals aboard that ship began receiving a qualitatively different signal. not the broad dementia that drove ordinary colonists toward violence. Something focused, surgical. The marker had identified, through whatever biological or cognitive mechanism it uses, the people whose minds could sustain a deeper message. For those people, it sent something specific. It sent the dead back. The hallucinations that marker-touched individuals experience are never random. They take the form of people the subject has already lost. They look real. They speak in ways that feel consistent with who those lost people actually were. And the messages they deliver, without exception, serve the marker's agenda. Nicole Brennan, a medical officer aboard the Ishimura who had ended her own life long before the events of the first game began, appeared to an engineer named Isaac Clarke throughout his entire ordeal on that ship. She guided him. She directed him toward the marker. She pushed him toward the actions the marker needed him to take. He believed he was following someone he loved. He was following instructions. The marker doesn't simply broadcast a uniform signal into vulnerable minds. It reads the specific content of what is inside a person and uses it. Your grief becomes its vehicle. The people you would do anything for become the voice of the signal. And the marker doesn't need you to consciously believe in it as an alien artifact. It needs you to trust the face it chooses to wear. That is not the behavior of a weapon. A weapon doesn't care whether you understand it or cooperate with it. The marker cares deeply about your cooperation. It needs you functional, purposeful, and moving in a specific direction long enough to accomplish something very particular. What that something is becomes clear once you understand what the signal did to Isaac Clarke's mind over the course of his time aboard the Ishimura. The marker made a copy of its own blueprints. Then it pressed those blueprints into the neural architecture of a man whose brain was specifically compatible with the signal's deeper frequencies. Isaac didn't know it had happened. The weight of what he had survived buried the imprint beneath exhaustion and trauma. But the blueprint was there, patient as the signal that placed it, waiting for the right conditions to be extracted and put to use. He walked away from Aegis VII carrying the instructions for building another marker. And somewhere, something that had been waiting for exactly that outcome had already begun to prepare for what came next. The people who called the marker a god were about to discover how useful they had always been designed to be, and a government that thought it could extract the marker's power without paying its price was about to learn why every civilization that had ever tried this before had reached the same conclusion. The same one the alien race on a frozen planet at the edge of the galaxy had reached thousands of years earlier, when they looked up at what was forming above them in orbit and built a machine to stop it. That's where this story is heading. But before we get there, we need to understand what happened to the one man in the franchise whose mind became the marker's most important instrument. Because Isaac Clarke's story isn't about a survivor who got lucky. It's about someone who was specifically selected, and the difference between those two things is everything. Chapter 3. The colony breaks open. The removal of Marker 3A from Aegis VII did not begin with violence. Before the extraction team moved in, before the first necromorph rose from what had been a living person, the marker did what it always does when something threatens to interrupt its work. It spoke. The artifact emitted a burst of energy as the extraction team prepared to separate it from its pedestal, and 60 Unitologists gathered in the colony's central gathering space interpreted that burst exactly the way the marker had been training them to interpret everything it produced. They saw it as the voice of something sacred, something calling them home. 60 people, led by Deacon Abbott, ended their own lives together in what they experienced as an act of devotion. The extraction team's own engineer killed the rest of his crew while in the grip of a hallucination he could not distinguish from reality. And with enough fresh bodies now available in the surrounding area, the infection the marker had been cultivating for 200 years woke up. The necromorphs that overran Aegis VII weren't new. They were the result of an outbreak that had happened 2 centuries before the events of Dead Space, back when Marker 3A was first placed on the planet and the original research colony became the disaster that ended the Sovereign Colonies program. The biomass from that outbreak had converged beneath the planetary surface over 200 years into a massive necromorph entity called the Hive Mind. It had been dormant under the ice and rock, waiting the way the marker had been waiting. growing slowly in the dark while generations of humans lived above it with no idea what was stored below them. When Marker 3A was separated from its pedestal and the containment field shifted, the hive mind woke. The infection spread from the colony to the USG Ishimura, the Concordance Extraction Corporation mining vessel that had come to Aegis VII with Unitologist support for the express purpose of recovering the marker. Within a short time, almost everyone aboard the ship was dead or transformed. The few who survived were not surviving because they were lucky. They were surviving because the marker had specific uses for specific people and kept them alive long enough to serve those uses. When the USG Kellyan arrived, carrying Isaac Clarke, responding to the Ishimura's distress signal, the marker had already begun its work on him. Isaac's original reason for volunteering for the mission was personal. Nicole Brennan, the woman he'd been in a relationship with, had been stationed on the Ishimura as a medical officer. He wanted to find her. That motivation, the desire to protect someone he loved, was exactly the kind of emotional landscape the marker needed to work with. Nicole had been dead before Isaac ever arrived. Her final message to Isaac, recorded and transmitted before she ended her own life aboard the Ishimura, contained the truth. The infection had spread through the ship. There was no rescue coming. She saw no way forward. By the time Isaac boarded the Ishimura and heard her voice guiding him, the Nicole leading him through the ship was not a recording, was not a ghost, was not a fragment of her actual consciousness. She was a hallucination assembled by the marker using Isaac's grief and memory, shaped precisely to appear believable enough to make him cooperative. The marker studied what Isaac loved and built a puppet from it. Every instruction the Nicole hallucination gave him, every direction she sent him in, every moment of apparent tenderness that made him trust the vision, all of it was the marker directing its architect. The mission Isaac believed he was on was to find Nicole and stop the outbreak. The mission the marker had given him, delivered through the face of the person whose death he hadn't yet accepted, was to return the artifact to its pedestal on the planet's surface and keep it functioning long enough to accomplish its next step. Isaac returned the marker to Aegis VII's surface. He killed the hive mind. He escaped in a shuttle as a chunk of planetary mass mined by the Ishimura's planet-cracking process crashed into the colony area, destroying the colony and ending the immediate outbreak. The straightforward reading of Dead Space's events ends there. The man survived. The marker was destroyed. The outbreak was stopped. Crisis resolved. That reading misses the most important thing the marker accomplished during those events. Marker 3A had a problem that had existed for 200 years. A convergence event requires the absorption of the marker's makers, the specific people who created it, as the final step. The Sovereign Colony's scientists who built Marker 3A died in the original outbreak 2 centuries before Isaac arrived. Their bodies were gone. The marker could not complete convergence with Isaac because Isaac hadn't made anything yet. He was an engineer, not an architect. Not yet, so Marker 3A adapted its approach. Unable to complete convergence on its own timeline, the artifact focused on the next available strategy. It identified the person aboard the Ishimura whose brain was most compatible with its signal. It spent the entire crisis pressing that brain into contact with as much of its encoding as possible, and when Isaac Clarke walked away from Aegis VII, he was carrying something inside his neural architecture that he had no conscious awareness of, a compressed, complete, self-replicating blueprint for marker construction, stored in the specific regions of his brain that had resonated most strongly with the signal. The marker on Aegis VII had failed at its immediate goal, but it had planted a seed in the most capable mind it had encountered in 2 centuries of waiting. That seed was going to grow somewhere with far more resources than a remote mining world. A woman named Kendra Daniels had been on the Kellyan crew under the cover of being a systems analyst. Her actual employer was EarthGov. Her actual mission was to secure Marker 3A for the government. When she revealed this to Isaac near the end of events on Aegis VII, she took the marker before the destruction of the planet could claim it. She was killed by the hive mind before she could escape with it, and the marker was ultimately destroyed when the chunk of Aegis VII collided with the colony. But EarthGov already knew about the imprint Isaac was carrying. They had recovered his shuttle, and they were going to spend the next 3 years making sure that what was stored in Isaac Clarke's mind didn't go to waste. Here is where the story shifts into its second phase. Everything that happened on Aegis VII, the outbreak, the necromorphs, the hive mind, the survival of one engineer out of everyone aboard that ship, was a setup. The marker on Aegis VII accomplished its primary objective not by triggering convergence, but by finding its next architect and imprinting him completely before allowing itself to be destroyed. That's worth sitting with for a moment. The marker that burned at the bottom of Aegis VII did not fail. The most dangerous thing it ever produced was not the hive mind. The most dangerous thing it produced was Isaac Clarke, walking away from the ruins believing he had won. What EarthGov did with him next is the part of this story that most people move through too quickly, because the 3 years between Dead Space and Dead Space 2 are where the franchise becomes something genuinely uncomfortable. Not just about alien artifacts and necromorphs, about what institutions do when they believe they've found the key to survival, and what happens when the key doesn't care whether they live or die. Chapter 4. The Man the Marker Chose. Before getting into what EarthGov did with Isaac Clarke, it helps to understand why they wanted him at all. The marker's signal affects different people in different ways. Research logs recovered throughout Dead Space 2 document this distinction carefully. For the majority of people exposed to the signal, the effect is noise, an overwhelming disruption of normal cognitive function that produces paranoia, violence, and eventually the kind of breakdown that creates necromorph fodder. These people are useful to the marker, but only as raw material. They provide the dead organic tissue the infection converts and accumulates toward convergence. Their cooperation is not required. Their collapse is sufficient. A smaller group responds differently. The signal is the same. The source is the same. But something about how certain brains process the incoming transmission converts it from noise into information. These individuals don't simply hear disruption. They hear something like structure, patterns, sequences. A scientist within EarthGov's research program summarized it plainly. People with the right kind of mind see codes and blueprints where everyone else just hears what drives them toward madness. Isaac Clarke was one of those people. His profession as an engineer meant his mind was already organized around the task of understanding how complex systems fit together, how components interact, how a structure that looks confusing from the outside can be decoded through patient systematic analysis. The marker's encoding had found a brain that was specifically capable of receiving it and storing it intact, where a less technically oriented person would experience the signal as an incomprehensible assault. Isaac's mind translated it into something close to schematics. He was not, in the marker's terms, a victim. He was a vessel. EarthGov understood this almost immediately after recovering his escape shuttle following the Aegis VII disaster. The government placed him in a psychiatric facility on Titan Station, a massive civilian and industrial settlement built into one of the moons of Saturn, and they began studying the contents of his mind under a program called Project Telomere. Isaac was designated Patient 4. A scientist named Nolan Strauss, who had encountered a shard of Marker 3A aboard a separate vessel sent to investigate Aegis VII's aftermath, became Patient 5. The method EarthGov used to extract the marker blueprints from Isaac's brain is one of the genuinely disturbing details of the franchise. A device called the Noonlight Diagnostics Machine operated by inserting a needle through the patient's eye directly into a specific region of the brain that processed the marker's signal. Through this instrument, the researchers could stimulate and read the marker-encoded patterns stored in Isaac's neural architecture, and transfer that information into usable data for construction purposes. Between sessions, they gave Isaac memory suppressants. The suppressants kept him from consciously accessing what was stored in his own mind. They also kept him from remembering the sessions themselves, meaning that from Isaac's perspective, he was simply a man with severe dementia and PTSD being treated at a medical facility, with no memory of what was being done to him during the procedures. 3 years of this, 3 years of having his mind read through a needle while he was made to forget each session before the next one began. Director Hans Tiedemann oversaw the project. He described Isaac's marker-touched mind as the purest they had found, the cleanest, most complete imprint of the marker's encoding among all the subjects they had studied. Other researchers were pulled into contact with Isaac's information during sessions, and at least one of them, a scientist named Kinner Phelps, became so saturated with the replication formulas that he began hearing them continuously in his own mind. Phelps eventually built a marker independently, working alone, compelled by a signal he had absorbed secondhand from a man who had absorbed it from an artifact. The contamination spread outward like ripples. 3 years of extraction produced enough data to build something remarkable. The Site-12 marker was constructed in the Sprawl, Titan Station, the largest marker humanity had ever created, described as a fully expressed physical representation of the algorithms embedded in Isaac Clarke's mind. EarthGov built it in the belief that with sufficient safeguards, with shielding systems and containment protocols developed from their research into marker behavior, they could harness its energy safely. The resource crisis was real. Humanity genuinely needed what the marker appeared to offer. Director Tiedemann and his team believed they had studied the previous failures thoroughly enough to avoid repeating them. The shielding held, right up until it didn't. There is a concept studied in the field of organizational safety called the normalization of deviance. The pattern works like this. A system is designed with specific safety thresholds in mind. Early operations reveal that the system is functioning slightly outside those thresholds, but without immediate catastrophic consequences. The people running the system make a rational decision. The deviation is small, the consequences haven't materialized, and the project is too important to halt over a theoretical risk. Over time, the deviation becomes normal. The threshold itself is quietly redefined around the deviation, and the accumulated weight of individually defensible decisions eventually reaches a point where the system fails in a way that was entirely predictable, but that no single step along the way made feel inevitable. EarthGov's marker program followed this pattern precisely. The previous disasters, the original Crozier facility, the Aegis VII colony, the Ishimura, the USG O'Bannon that had investigated Aegis VII's aftermath, each one had been documented, analyzed, and filed. EarthGov had access to more information about what markers do to human populations than any previous institution in history. They knew about the dementia signal. They knew about the necromorph contagion. They knew that shielding systems appeared to block the signal on external sensors while internal readings went off the scale. A research log preserved from the project notes exactly this. A scientist recording that the dampening system should be blocking the signal completely, that nothing registers outside the shield walls, but that the signal is still getting through inside. That log was filed. The project continued. The instinctive response to this is to categorize Tiedemann and the EarthGov researchers as simply evil, as people who didn't care about the consequences because they cared about the power. But that framing is too simple and ultimately less frightening than the truth. The more accurate reading is that these were people who believed they were responsible stewards of an extremely dangerous resource, who had convinced themselves through accumulating rationalization that their program was controlled where the previous ones had not been, who genuinely thought the resource crisis justified the risk, and who were simply wrong in a way that killed tens of thousands of people. The marker had engineered exactly that outcome. Consider the sequence from the marker's perspective. Marker 3A identified the right host on Aegis VII. It imprinted that host with complete marker construction data. The host survived and was recovered by the most powerful institution in the human sphere. That institution, facing a genuine crisis that made the marker's energy output attractive, extracted the construction data and built a new marker in the most populated civilian station in the inner system. The new marker was larger and more powerful than the original. Every step of this sequence was set in motion by the original signal imprint. EarthGov didn't build the Site-12 marker because they were foolish or malicious. They built it because the marker on Aegis VII had specifically and successfully manipulated the chain of events that led to a new, stronger marker being constructed in an optimal location. Titan Station housed a massive population. A massive population meant a massive supply of biomass for necromorph conversion, and a marker built from the purest human imprint of marker encoding yet achieved would be far better positioned for convergence than the original artifact buried on an uninhabited world. The marker on Aegis VII had not failed when it allowed itself to be destroyed. It had reproduced. Now think about what this means for the original question. Is the red marker actually trying to save humanity? The marker's relationship to human survival at this point in the story is not one of predation in the simple sense. It's something closer to what happens in agriculture. A farmer doesn't want the seed to die. The farmer wants the seed to grow into the exact kind of plant that produces the most and best future seeds. The marker's relationship to intelligent civilizations follows this logic. Humans were useful. Humans built things. Humans spread across multiple planets, establishing colonies that could house new markers. Humans who survived marker outbreaks and retained the imprint could serve as architects, walking construction manuals for the next artifact in the sequence. The marker preserved the people it needed, eliminated the ones it didn't, and used the institutions that intelligent civilizations build, governments, corporations, research programs, religious structures, as tools for its own expansion. What looked like salvation, the promise of limitless energy, the return of a dead loved one, the feeling of cosmic purpose, was always the marker's most effective recruiting mechanism. Not because the marker wanted you happy, because cooperation is more efficient than resistance when you need something built. Isaac Clarke woke up in a padded cell on Titan Station with no memory of the previous 3 years, covered in marker symbols he had scratched into the walls during episodes he couldn't recall, wearing a straitjacket while a necromorph outbreak tore through the station's corridors. The marker had finished using Project Telomere for its purposes. It was time for the next phase, and the woman whose face had guided Isaac through Aegis VII was about to reappear, not to help him escape, to guide him somewhere specific. Somewhere the marker had been building towards since the moment it pressed its blueprints into his brain above a dying planet. The marker wasn't done with him. The question Dead Space 2 asks, the question the franchise asks with increasing directness across every sequel, is whether Isaac Clarke would end up being the marker's greatest success, or, in a way that no other human being had managed before, its first genuine failure. That answer depends on understanding what the marker actually needs from its architects in the final step, and what it needs from them, what it always needs from the people it has carefully cultivated and guided and kept alive through every disaster, is the one thing the franchise uses to define what convergence actually is, which is where the next chapter begins. Chapter 5. The Sprawl Comes Alive. Isaac Clarke woke up in a room padded on every surface, wearing a straitjacket, with no memory of the previous 3 years. The walls around him were covered in marker symbols. He had scratched them there himself, in sessions he couldn't recall, compelled by whatever was stored in his brain during the brief periods when the memory suppressants wore thin enough for the signal to push through. 3 years of that. 3 years of being studied, erased, and studied again while believing in the fragments of experience the drugs allowed him to retain, that he was simply a very damaged man receiving psychiatric care in a very secure facility. A man named Franco de Leo came to free him. Franco had been sent by a Unitologist organization that had been watching Isaac's situation closely, and believed that what was stored in his mind belonged to the Church rather than to EarthGov. Within moments of reaching Isaac's cell, Franco was transformed into a necromorph. The outbreak on Titan Station was already well underway before Isaac processed where he was. The Site-12 marker, constructed in the government sector, using the marker blueprints extracted from Isaac's brain across 3 years of Project Telomere sessions, had done what every marker eventually does when the conditions around it are right. The dementia signal had been spreading through the station's population for the entire period of the project. The researchers and security personnel working in proximity to the artifact had been deteriorating in ways that the project protocols classified as manageable side effects, rather than evidence that the system was failing. The necromorph outbreak that tore through the sprawl during Dead Space 2 was not sudden. It was the completion of a process that had been building since the first session with the Noonlight diagnostics machine. By the time Isaac was awake and moving through the station, tens of thousands of civilians who had been living in the sections of Titan Station far from the government sector had no idea what had been constructed in their midst. They had been going about their lives in a settlement built into the remains of Saturn's largest moon, while the largest marker humanity had ever created was assembled below them, the Sprawl's own protocols. Confirmed in logs Isaac recovered throughout the station, had a clause specifically addressing the possibility of a necromorph outbreak during Project Telomere. The clause explicitly forbade the evacuation of the civilian population. The researchers had determined that evacuating residents would compromise the project's containment posture and risk public exposure of the program. So, if an outbreak occurred, the tens of thousands of people living in the civilian sections of Titan Station were simply not to be told. This was the institution's answer to the question of what the people in the sprawl were worth relative to the marker program. It's not a comfortable answer. A woman named Dana Ligon made contact with Isaac through the station's systems in the early stages of his survival effort. She told him she could cure his dementia, which was described as a progressive condition that would eventually kill him if not treated. She directed him toward her location. Isaac followed, partly because he had no other immediate source of direction, and partly because the claim that the dementia could be cured was the first piece of information he had received that suggested his situation wasn't simply fatal. When he reached Dana, she revealed that she was an agent of the Church of Unitology. Her actual goal had never been to cure Isaac. The Church wanted the marker blueprints stored in his brain, and wanted him to construct markers for Unitology specifically, advancing the Church's goal of triggering convergence on their own terms rather than EarthGov's. The cure was a mechanism for getting Isaac to walk toward her voluntarily. She was killed before she could carry out the plan. In that moment, Isaac's situation became very simple. EarthGov wanted him dead rather than free, because a man walking around with marker construction data in his head represented a security breach they couldn't manage. The Church of Unitology wanted to use him as a construction tool. The marker in the government sector was actively driving the station toward convergence, and somewhere in the deteriorating facility, a man named Nolan Strauss, who had been Patient 5 in Project Telomere after his contact with a shard of marker 3A aboard a separate vessel, held a piece of information about how the Site-12 marker could be destroyed. Strauss was falling apart. His contact with the marker shard had been less complete than Isaac's imprint from the full artifact on Aegis VII, and the dementia had taken deeper root. He could still communicate in stretches, still provide fragments of what he'd learned during his own sessions with the Noonlight diagnostics machine, but the coherent intervals were getting shorter. Isaac needed what Strauss knew before the dementia consumed whatever was left of him. There's something in that dynamic worth pausing on. The marker had selected two people with compatible minds, imprinted both of them with pieces of its encoding, and placed them in the same facility under EarthGov's care. One of them received the full blueprint imprint and retained enough cognitive function to be used as a construction architect. The other received a partial imprint and deteriorated toward violence. Research on why some individuals are more resistant to psychological and physiological stressors than others suggests that the difference isn't simply a matter of intelligence or toughness. Brain architecture, the specific way different minds organize and process complex information, produces wildly variable responses to identical stimuli. The marker had encountered this variation in every civilization it touched. Most people broke. A small number became useful. Strauss eventually broke completely. Near the end, the dementia overtook whatever reasoning remained, and he attacked Ellie Langford, a Concordance Extraction Corporation engineer who had been helping Isaac navigate the sprawl. Isaac had to kill him to stop the attack. Ellie survived. She would matter later. Isaac reached the Site-12 marker deep in the government sector after working his way through a station in full collapse. The scale of the artifact, described throughout the game's lore as a fully expressed representation of the encoding in Isaac's brain, was significantly larger than anything the sovereign colonies had produced in the 23rd century. The marker construction process Isaac's mind had contributed to had apparently expanded the artifact's size proportionally to the completeness of the imprint used to create it. The Convergence Event began before Isaac reached the marker. Necromorphs throughout the surrounding area gathered near the artifact in a pattern consistent with the marker's final phase. The creature's signal pulled the accumulated biomass toward the convergence vortex. Bodies rose, the marker flashed and generated a pull that dragged necromorphic tissue upward into the space above it, beginning the formation of what would become a Brethren moon if the process completed. Nicole appeared. The hallucination of Nicole Brennan that the marker had been using to guide Isaac throughout his ordeal on the sprawl made its final argument to him at the foot of the artifact. It told him what convergence required of him. The maker must be absorbed. The person whose mind had served as the blueprint for the Site-12 marker's construction needed to be drawn into the forming entity above in order to complete the process. The hallucination guided him toward that outcome with the same gentleness and apparent love it had used to guide him through every other task the marker needed him to perform. The face of someone he had failed to save. The voice of someone whose loss he still hadn't processed. The specific grief that the marker had identified as Isaac's most vulnerable place and had been pressing on very carefully and consistently since the moment it first catalogued his mind above Aegis VII. Isaac Clarke refused. The confrontation the game presents at that moment is partly physical and partly something else. The lore frames it as Isaac defeating the Nicole apparition within his own mind, breaking the marker's hold on his psychology by directly confronting the grief and guilt the marker had been using as its control mechanism. He destroyed the Site-12 marker. The Convergence Event collapsed. Titan Station began to fall apart around him. Ellie Langford got a shuttle to him. They escaped. This is the moment in the franchise where something genuinely unusual happens. Not in terms of survival. Isaac had survived before. The unusual thing is that a person the marker had specifically selected, specifically cultivated, specifically guided through years of manipulation and loss, successfully refused the final request. The marker had found its architect, imprinted him, kept him alive through disasters that killed everyone around him, guided him through the construction of the largest marker humanity had ever built, and then watched him destroy it instead of being consumed by it. That had not been the plan. Now consider what the marker's position was at the end of Dead Space 2. The Site-12 marker was destroyed. The Convergence Event on Titan Station had been stopped. Isaac Clarke was still alive and still carrying the marker's blueprints in his mind, which meant he remained a potential architect for future construction. EarthGov's infrastructure on the sprawl was gone. The civilian death toll from the outbreak was catastrophic, and somewhere across human space, the markers that EarthGov had distributed to other colonies and research facilities during their replication program were still active, still broadcasting, still cultivating the populations around them. The program had spread the infection far wider than the original artifact ever could have reached on its own. Whatever the marker's broader network had been building toward was not stopped by the destruction of one artifact on Titan Station. The system had far more pieces in play than one engineer with a plasma cutter could reach in a single outbreak. And an organization that had been working toward this moment for 300 years was about to make the decision that would either fulfill everything it had been built for or confirm that belief, however sincere, is not the same as wisdom. Chapter 6: 300 Years of Faith. Jacob Danik believed completely. That is the first thing to understand about him, because it shapes every action he takes in Dead Space 3. And distinguishes him from the kind of antagonist who uses belief as a cover for simpler motivations. Danik was the leader of a radical Unitologist group called the Circle, and his stated goal was to free the markers from EarthGov's containment program and allow convergence to proceed naturally. He described the government's efforts to contain the signal as a violation of what he called the natural course of things. He saw the necromorph outbreaks not as disasters to be prevented, but as sacred events being interfered with by institutions too frightened to accept what the marker was offering. He was not performing this belief for an audience. He acted on it at every turn, consistently, at great personal cost, through situations where a less sincere person would have reconsidered. The franchise never reveals him to be secretly pragmatic underneath his faith. He is precisely what he appears to be. a man who looked at the evidence of what the marker does and concluded that it was good. That is more frightening than cynicism. A person who uses belief instrumentally can, in principle, be reached through reason or through consequences. A person for whom the belief is total, for whom the evidence that the belief produces harm is itself evidence that the belief is correct, cannot be argued out of the position because the position was never arrived at through argument. Research on high-control belief systems has found that the most cohesive and dangerous organizations are not primarily built on deception. The organizations where leadership privately disbelieves what they preach to followers tend to be fragile because the leaders are capable of calculating when the cost exceeds the benefit. The truly durable organizations are the ones where the people at the top believe as completely as the people at the bottom, because true believers don't have a threshold at which the evidence becomes sufficient to reconsider. Every piece of contrary evidence gets absorbed into the belief as further confirmation. Danick saw every outbreak, every necromorph swarm, every human death produced by marker exposure as confirmation that convergence was real, that the marker's promise was genuine, and that EarthGov's interference was the only thing preventing humanity from reaching the transcendence it was designed for. The Church of Unitology had two layers, and this distinction matters for understanding how the organization had lasted 300 years. The ordinary membership of Unitology, the billions of people who practiced its rituals and carried its beliefs into daily life, understood convergence as spiritual, a merging of consciousness, the end of individual mortality, something like heaven, approached through the marker rather than through death alone. These were not people who wanted to watch their neighbors transform into monsters. They understood the doctrine through a framework of transcendence, not through a framework of mass biological conversion. The leadership of the church, a group known as the Enigmas who wore distinctive gold masks and conducted their work through closed gatherings inaccessible to ordinary members, understood things differently. The Enigmas knew about the necromorphs. They had preserved specimens. They understood what the marker actually produced, and they interpreted that production as literal evidence that the artifact could deliver what it promised. The necromorphs were not a failure of convergence. They were the proof of it. The body continuing after death, reshaped, still moving, still part of something larger. In the Enigmas' interpretation, that was the marker fulfilling its function. This is a crucial distinction because it explains why the Church could act as a coherent organization across 3 centuries while simultaneously advocating for events that would kill billions of people. The ordinary membership didn't understand what they were advocating for. The leadership understood exactly what they were advocating for and called it salvation. Cults and high control groups, studied by researchers in social psychology, tend to operate through a similar layered structure. There is a public-facing version of the belief that is accessible, warm, and emphasizes community and meaning. There is an inner version available only to those who have demonstrated sufficient commitment, which is more demanding and often substantially different from what was presented at the beginning. The gap between the outer and inner belief systems is not incidental. It is the mechanism through which the organization recruits people who would not join if they understood the full doctrine from the start, and retains them long enough that by the time they understand what they've joined, they have invested too much to leave easily. Unitology had practiced this structure for 300 years. The vast majority of its billions of members were sincere worshippers of something they genuinely believed was a path toward meaning and transcendence. The institution's leadership was using their faith, their resources, their political influence, and their willingness to sacrifice to advance an agenda that, if they had understood it clearly at the beginning, most of them would have walked away from. Altman's murder had seeded this. Stevens and Markoff had designed it this way deliberately. 3 centuries of institutional growth had perfected it. Isaac Clarke and John Carver eventually traced the source of the marker network's origin signal to a planet called Tau Volantis, following the work of earlier researchers from the Sovereign Colony's armed forces, who had used signals from multiple marker sites to triangulate a point of origin in deep space. The planet was frozen, its surface a continuous wasteland of ice, with evidence of a prior civilization buried beneath the permafrost. And above it, in orbit, was something that had been there for a very long time and had not been able to complete what it started. Danik followed them there. The Codex, a device capable of controlling a machine built by the alien civilization that had once lived on Tau Volantis, passed through several hands during the events on that planet. Danik ultimately took it, and with it, he did what the Circle had always intended to do. He used the Codex to shut down the machine. The machine had been keeping the moon above Tau Volantis, frozen in an incomplete state of convergence for thousands of years. Danik turned it off. The frozen moon began to wake. Danik died in the chaos that the waking moon produced, killed in the collapse of structures around him as the planet reacted to the moon's resumed attempt at completing convergence. The exact circumstances of his death are not elaborated on beyond that. What matters is that he achieved his stated goal. He freed the marker. He let convergence proceed. He died in the event he had spent his life working toward. From inside the belief system he had built his identity around. That outcome was probably coherent. He had fulfilled his purpose. He had removed the obstruction. He had, in the terms Unitology used for the concept, been made whole. The machine he turned off is the part of this story that almost nobody in the franchise had known existed. The alien civilization that built it had understood something about the marker cycle that 300 years of human research had never reached. They had encountered the same sequence humanity was working through. The black marker arriving, the necromorph contagion spreading, convergence beginning above their world, and they had found a way to stop it. Understanding what they built and what it cost them to build it is where the question this video is built around finally gets an answer that means something. Because the alien machine on Tau Volantis didn't stop the marker by destroying it. Destroying a marker is extremely difficult, as the franchise establishes across multiple games. The materials the artifacts are constructed from are not easily damaged by conventional means. Fragments retain the signal's properties even after the main structure is broken. The marker imprints the information for its own reconstruction into the minds of people near enough to receive it deeply, meaning that destroying an artifact doesn't necessarily destroy the knowledge required to build another one. Isaac Clarke was living proof of that. He had destroyed 3 markers by the time Dead Space 3 begins, and was still walking around carrying the blueprints for them. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis found a different approach. They didn't try to destroy the marker. They built something capable of putting the incomplete Brethren moon into permanent stasis, freezing the Convergence Event before it could complete, trapping the forming entity in a half-finished state above their world indefinitely, and then they disappeared from the historical record entirely. There is no confirmed explanation in the games for what happened to the alien civilization after they activated the machine. The lore does not elaborate on their fate beyond the evidence of their absence. Whatever they paid to stop the convergence, they paid it. The machine ran without them for thousands of years, keeping the half-formed moon frozen and dormant in orbit above a world that had become a wasteland of ice. Keep that in mind, the only civilization in the franchise's known history that successfully interrupted the marker's cycle apparently didn't survive the interruption. That asymmetry is important, because when Isaac Clarke and John Carver finally understood what they were dealing with on Tau Volantis, they were standing in the ruins of the only evidence that the marker's plan could be stopped, and the incomplete moon above them, frozen in mid-convergence for 200 million years, had spent that entire time broadcasting a signal through every marker in its network, asking anyone who could hear it to come and turn the machine off. The message the marker had been sending through every outbreak, every hallucination, every set of blueprints pressed into a compatible human mind, was not what the franchise calls make us whole in isolation. It was a distress call from something half-born and trapped, begging through every channel available to it for the means to finish becoming what it was supposed to be. Every necromorph outbreak in human history had been, in part, the incomplete moon above Tau Volantis trying to get someone to come and free it from the machine that was keeping it frozen. The people who heard that signal and called it God had been listening to a cry for help from something that wanted to consume them. And the question now, with the Tau Volantis moon finally awake, and Isaac and Carver still standing on the planet's surface with the Codex and access to the machine, is whether what the aliens built could be turned back on. If it could be turned off, it could be turned back on. Whether that would be enough is a different question, and answering it requires understanding what the franchise eventually reveals about how many of these things are out there, how long the network has been running, and why the signal that sounds like salvation is the most effective instrument of harvest ever deployed across the known galaxy. That's where the next chapter goes. Because the Brethren Moons are not the end of the story, they are the beginning of the question that the entire franchise was always really asking. Chapter 7: The Ice World Speaks. Long before Isaac Clarke had ever heard the name Tau Volantis, someone else had already been there. The evidence of that earlier visit hangs in orbit around the planet in the opening moments of Dead Space 3. Derelict ships, frozen solid, caught in the gravity of a world covered entirely in ice. Ships that still have people inside them, preserved in the cold, dead in ways that suggest the end came quickly and without warning. Military vessels from an organization that predated EarthGov, the Sovereign Colony's armed forces, sent to this remote location at the edge of explored space at some point in the past and never recalled. Whatever they found here, whatever they discovered about the planet below and the thing orbiting above it, was classified under a protocol called Scenario 5. Scenario 5, based on what the logs Isaac recovers throughout the game reveal, was essentially an extinction-level containment order. Destroy the evidence, destroy the research, destroy the people who had gathered that research, ensure that whatever was found on Tau Volantis stayed on Tau Volantis. Someone in the Sovereign Colony's government had received the reports from this expedition and decided that the information was too dangerous to bring home. The ships were abandoned in orbit. The people aboard them were left to die in the dark above a frozen world. Whatever the researchers had learned about the planet and the incomplete structure above it was sealed so thoroughly that by the time EarthGov replaced the Sovereign Colonies and 3 centuries passed, the expedition had been effectively erased. It was a geophysicist's work, preserved in fragments across those abandoned ships, that eventually guided Ellie Langford and her crew to Tau Volantis in the first place. One researcher, referred to in the recovered logs as Dr. Serrano, had gotten further than anyone else in understanding what Tau Volantis actually was. His work pointed toward a single conclusion that the Sovereign Colony's government had apparently found so alarming that they triggered Scenario 5 rather than allow it to reach the wider scientific community. Tau Volantis was not simply a planet where something terrible had happened. It was the origin point of the marker signal, the location where the entire network, broadcasting through every red marker in human space, was ultimately coming from. Finding Ellie's ship, the CMS Roanoke, adrift among the frozen derelicts, is where Dead Space 3's central thread properly begins. Ellie had survived. Her crew was reduced, and what they had pieced together from Serrano's work and from what they had found in the ice below was enough to suggest that the machine the alien civilization had built on Tau Volantis was real, was still running, and was the only thing standing between the current state of the universe and a completed convergence event on a scale that would reach far beyond a single planet. The surface of Tau Volantis is one of the more striking environments in the franchise, and it matters to pause on what it communicates before moving into analysis. The planet is completely frozen, an ice world with no visible liquid water and no surviving ecology above the microbial level. Buried in the ice, visible in places where the terrain has shifted or been excavated, are markers, hundreds of them, possibly thousands. Red markers created by the alien civilization that once lived on this world, created in the same way every intelligent species that encounters a black marker eventually creates them, through the marker's influence pressing on their minds until building copies feels like the most natural and necessary thing in the world. The sheer number of markers visible across Tau Volantis' surface tells a story about how thoroughly that alien civilization had been worked on. They had done exactly what humanity had been doing across multiple colonies and research facilities. They had studied the black marker, found that it seemed to offer something extraordinary, and had replicated it across their civilization on a massive scale. The markers had guided their development, shaped their technology and culture around the artifacts, and ultimately positioned them for a convergence event that consumed their entire world's population. What those aliens left behind, beyond the markers and the frozen ruins of their civilization, was the machine. Finding Rosetta is the moment the franchise provides the clearest window into what actually happened on Tau Volantis thousands of years before the events of any of the games. Rosetta is a dissected alien specimen, the body of one of the planet's original inhabitants, separated into pieces and stored in different locations across the alien research facility Isaac and his companions explore. Assembling the pieces gives Isaac a direct vision of the alien civilization's history. The lore presents this as the markers encoding, stored in the alien's preserved biology, transmitting its record into a compatible mind. The vision confirms the essential shape of the story. The alien race found the black marker. They were influenced by its signal in ways that are recognizable from everything the franchise has established about how the marker works on intelligent populations. They created red markers. The contagion spread. The Convergence Event began above their world, with the accumulated biomass of their dead pulling toward each other in the sky above the planet, forming the core of what would have become a completed Brethren moon. The surviving aliens stopped it. How they managed to stop an active Convergence Event is something the franchise doesn't explain in specific technical terms. The machine they built is described in broad functional terms. It is capable of applying an effect powerful enough to freeze an entire planet's surface and halt the physical process of a Brethren moon's formation. The Codex, a device that interfaces with the machine, allows whoever holds it to activate, deactivate, or adjust what the machine does. The exact engineering behind any of this is not elaborated on in the games, and it would be inaccurate to describe it in more specific terms than the lore provides. What is shown clearly is the result. The machine froze Tau Volantis. The incomplete moon above it was locked in its partially formed state. The Convergence Event stopped mid-process, and the alien civilization that had survived long enough to build and activate the machine then disappeared from the historical record in ways the game doesn't explicitly account for. The franchise does not confirm what happened to the alien race after they activated the machine. Their fate is not explained in the games. What is certain is that they are gone. What remains is the machine, still running thousands of years after the people who built it ceased to exist, still keeping the frozen moon in its dormant state, still broadcasting a low-level signal through the marker network that the incomplete moon was using to beg for rescue. That is the detail worth sitting with. The thing orbiting Tau Volantis in an incomplete state had been broadcasting through every marker in the network for thousands of years. Every signal the markers had been sending to human populations, every hallucination, every blueprint burned into a compatible mind, every whisper urging the people who heard it to come find the origin point and turn off whatever was keeping the moon frozen, was the incomplete entity above Tau Volantis trying to free itself. The phrase the franchise uses most often, the one the markers repeat to their most receptive subjects, is a plea for wholeness, for unification, for the completion of something that feels perpetually unfinished. Unitology built an entire theology around that phrase, interpreting it as the marker's promise of transcendence and spiritual union. The actual source of the phrase, revealed in Dead Space 3, is a half-formed moon that has been stranded in an incomplete state for millennia and is using every tool available to it to get someone to come turn off the machine, preventing it from finishing what it started. The faith of 300 years of Unitology was built on a cry for help from something that had been eating civilizations. Jacob Danik reached the machine on Tau Volantis ahead of Isaac and Carver. He had the Codex, and with the complete conviction that releasing the moon from its frozen state was the fulfillment of everything Unitology existed to bring about, he used the Codex to shut the machine down. The planet began to shake, the ice above the machine cracked, and the thing that had been suspended above Tau Volantis in frozen incompleteness for longer than human civilization had existed began, slowly, to resume the process it had been interrupted from thousands of years before. Now here is the part of this story that shifts the entire scope of the question this video is asking. The Tau Volantis moon waking up was not simply a local catastrophe, it was a signal, and the signal was received. Chapter 8: The Brethren Wake. The Tau Volantis moon, as it resumes convergence above the planet, is enormous in a way that the franchise takes its time making viscerally real. It is not simply a large necromorph. It is the size of a moon, a genuine planetoid composed of the compressed biological remains of an entire alien civilization's population, frozen mid-formation, now resuming the slow gravitational pull that will eventually drag what remains of Tau Volantis' surface up into itself to complete its shell. Isaac Clarke and John Carver are standing at the bottom of this, trying to reach the machine. Danik is killed by Isaac and Carver directly before they reach the machine. He does not survive to witness the full consequences of what he set in motion. He achieved what he set out to achieve. He removed the obstacle. He completed the mission he had built his life around. What he couldn't have understood, within the belief system that shaped every decision he made, is that the thing he freed had never intended to deliver what Unitology promised its followers. The transcendence Danik gave his life for was not on offer. The moon above him was not interested in elevating anyone. Its relationship to the human population of the surrounding region was purely biological. Isaac and Carver fight their way through the waking chaos of a planet whose machine has just been turned off, and whose orbiting moon is beginning to process the planet's surface the way a convergence event processes any world unfortunate enough to have produced a marker. They reach the machine. They use the codex, recovered through the events leading to this point, to reconfigure what the machine does rather than simply turning it back on. The exact mechanism is not explained in detail in the game's lore. What happens is clear. The Tau Volantis moon is pulled toward the planet instead of pulling the planet toward itself. Gravity inverts in the relevant direction. The moon falls. It hits Tau Volantis. The impact destroys the moon. The resulting explosion covers the planet's surface entirely. Isaac and Carver are caught in the destruction, and their survival is, on any rational physical basis, not something the game attempts to explain. They survive. The DLC Awakened provides what happens afterward, but before getting there, something happens in the moment the moon is destroyed that needs to be understood properly, because it is the piece of Dead Space 3 that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. When the Tau Volantis moon is destroyed, the marker signal across the galaxy goes silent. Every active marker stops broadcasting. The signal that had been pressing on human populations across multiple colonies, driving dementia, generating necromorphs, guiding compatible minds toward construction and convergence, simply stops. The research logs and environmental storytelling in the game's conclusion make clear that the marker's signal was being received from the Tau Volantis moon and rebroadcast outward. With the moon destroyed, the source of that signal is gone, and every marker in the network goes quiet. For a brief moment, it appears that Isaac Clarke has done something no being in the history of the franchise had ever done before. He has stopped the cycle. He has broken the mechanism. He has killed the thing at the center of the network and shut down every instrument it was using to harvest civilizations. That moment does not last, because the Tau Volantis moon was not alone. It never was. This is the revelation that Dead Space 3 builds toward across its entire runtime, and it is the piece of information that recontextualizes the scope of everything the franchise has been describing. The Brethren moons are not a single entity. They are not even a small group of related entities. They are a network spread across the galaxy, each one the product of a completed convergence event on a different civilization's world, each one connected through the marker signal to every other moon in the network. The Tau Volantis moon was incomplete, frozen, broadcasting in desperation for someone to come free it. The other moons, the ones that had successfully completed their convergence events in the past, and had been operational for unknown periods of time, were aware of the Tau Volantis moon's situation and had been receiving its signal. When the Tau Volantis moon was destroyed, its signal to the network did not simply end, it transmitted something in its final moments, something the other moons received, and what they did with that information is what the Awakened DLC describes. They turned toward the last known source of life they were aware of, Earth. The Awakened DLC, following Isaac and Carver as they escape Tau Volantis on the CMS Terra Nova and return to Earth's orbit, shows what has happened in the solar system during the events on the frozen planet. Necromorphs have overrun Earth. Transmissions from the planet confirm that the Brethren Moon Network is already acting on the information the Tau Volantis moon transmitted in its death. The moons are converging on the location of the remaining human population. The franchise ends there. Isaac and Carver, adrift above a planet being consumed. The DLC's final moments, leaving the outcome unresolved. The games do not provide a confirmed ending beyond that point. What the franchise does provide, across the full scope of its lore from Dead Space 1 through the Awakened DLC, is enough information to understand the complete picture of what the Brethren Moon Network is and how it operates. Understanding that picture is the thing that finally answers the question this video started with, because the answer is embedded in the structure of the network itself. Each Brethren Moon is the result of a successful convergence event on a civilized world. The number of moons in the network is not given a specific figure in the games. What is stated clearly is that there are multiple completed moons operating across the galaxy, and that they have been doing this long enough that the evidence of their activity spans deep history. Every civilization that encountered a black marker and followed the sequence through to its conclusion contributed a moon to the network. The scale of this implies something that the franchise handles through implication rather than explicit statement. Humanity is not the first species to go through this process. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis is not the first species to go through this process. There have been others, many others, an unknown number of species across the galaxy that found a black marker, replicated it, and eventually lost their entire population to the Convergence Event that the marker had always been building toward. The Brethren Moons are, in a very literal sense, made of civilizations. Each one is the compressed biological remains of a world's worth of intelligent life, reshaped into something vast and persistent, and capable of generating the signal that will do the same thing to the next species that finds the next marker on the next world. Research on how certain biological systems propagate across environments has found a recurring pattern in the most successful ones. The most persistent organisms in nature tend to be the ones that do not simply consume their hosts but use their hosts as vectors. They do not destroy the mechanism that spreads them. They use it, they sustain it long enough to be carried to the next location. What makes this strategy so effective from a purely biological perspective is that the host's own intelligence becomes the propagation engine. The more complex the host's behavior, the more sophisticated the propagation network becomes. The marker network operates on this logic at a galactic scale. Intelligent civilizations expand, they colonize multiple worlds, they develop faster than light travel, or its equivalent. They build institutions that persist across centuries. All of these characteristics, which any civilized species would develop through its natural progression, serve the marker's purposes directly. An intelligent civilization that has colonized multiple worlds provides the marker with multiple simultaneous harvest locations. An institution like Unitology, lasting 3 centuries and embedding itself in government at every level, provides the marker with a self-sustaining advocacy network that will resist any attempt to destroy the artifacts. The marker did not simply exploit human civilization. The marker's design was compatible with human civilization in a very specific way, because the traits that make a civilization effective at surviving also make it effective at spreading markers to new locations and generating the biomass conditions necessary for convergence. Here is where the question at the center of this video gets its most precise answer. The marker is not trying to save humanity. The marker is not trying to destroy humanity. Destruction is a byproduct of a process whose actual goal is something else entirely. The goal is reproduction. Each Brethren Moon contains a marker at its center, the artifact that triggered the convergence event that formed it, and that marker continues to broadcast from inside the moon's core to the other markers in the network. When a new Brethren Moon forms, it joins the network. The network grows. The signal reaches further. More civilizations in more star systems receive the signal. More black markers are sent toward promising worlds. More civilizations are guided toward intelligence, then toward the marker, then through the exact sequence of exploitation that produces the next moon. The network is self-propagating at a galactic scale, and has been operating for long enough that the evidence of its past activity is essentially invisible to any individual civilization encountering it for the first time, because the civilizations that went through the process before them are gone. Think about what that means for the people of Aegis VII, for the crews of the Ishimura, for the residents of Titan Station, for every unitologist who spent their life working toward convergence. They were not victims of malice, they were materials. The marker system doesn't have enemies and it doesn't have allies. It has resources and it has obstacles. The people who cooperated with it were resources. The people who tried to stop it were obstacles. Isaac Clarke was a resource until the moment he refused to complete his function, and then he became an obstacle. What is genuinely remarkable about Isaac Clarke's role in the franchise is not that he survived. Many people survived encounters with the marker long enough to be useful to it. The remarkable thing is that he successfully refused the final step twice, destroying 2 markers in succession in events where the marker's manipulation had brought him to the threshold of convergence, and then managed to destroy an incomplete, frozen Brethren moon, one that had never fully formed, something no human being had ever done. That achievement is real within the franchise's terms. It meant something, at least temporarily. What the Awakened DLC reveals is that even this achievement was, in the broader context of the Brethren Moon network, a local interruption at best. The other moons were already oriented toward the last remaining location of organic life they knew about, destroying one incomplete moon, one that had been frozen and dormant for millennia, did not break the network. It announced the network's awareness of Earth's location to every operational moon connected to it. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis had understood something, that humanity, across 300 years of unitology and governmental marker programs and individual survivors trying to stop one outbreak at a time, had never managed to grasp as a complete picture. The threat was not any individual marker. The threat was not even the Tau Volantis moon. The threat was systemic, galaxy-wide, and had been running long before any human being had ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what else was out there. The machine those aliens built was the one known successful response to a convergence event in the franchise's history. They froze their world, they stopped their moon, they disappeared. The franchise doesn't explain what happened to them. That absence of explanation is worth noting carefully rather than filling in. The games leave it open. Whether they survived the activation of the machine, whether they fled their frozen world, whether the process of stopping convergence cost them something specific and final, is not confirmed by anything in the lore. What can be said is that they managed to build a response that worked, at least locally, for thousands of years, and that when Danique turned it off, the thousands of years of protection it had provided ended in moments. The gap between that alien civilization's response and humanity's response is the most uncomfortable element of everything the Dead Space franchise builds toward. The aliens, facing the same sequence of events that humanity faces across 3 games, found a technical solution, a machine that worked. The cost of that solution is unknown, but whatever it was, they paid it. Humanity, 3 games in, ends with a necromorph outbreak on Earth and a network of operational Brethren moons converging on the last confirmed location of human life. That asymmetry is where the central question of this video comes into its final focus, because there is one more layer to what the marker signal actually was, one more piece of the picture that the franchise uses its final chapter to reveal, and it changes the emotional weight of every outbreak, every hallucination, every unitologist who genuinely believed they were working towards something good. The signal that humanity heard as an invitation was a distress call from something dying, or rather something that had never quite managed to finish being born. The Tau Volantis moon, stranded in its incomplete state for thousands of years, broadcasting through every marker in the network, sending the plea for wholeness through every compatible mind it could reach, was not communicating the promise of transcendence. It was communicating its own need, its own incompleteness, its own trapped condition. Whether the fully formed Brethren moons in the rest of the network experience something analogous to purpose or intention is not something the franchise addresses with any specificity. Their actions are clear. Their nature, beyond what their behavior demonstrates, is not elaborated on. What is clear is that everything humanity experienced as the marker's message, the visions of loved ones, the blueprints, the sense of cosmic purpose, the promise of wholeness, was the signal of a half-formed entity trying to complete itself using whatever resources were available. And the resources available happened to include every human being who had ever been close enough to hear the signal and believe it was meant for them. That is the answer to the question. It is not the answer anyone who believed in the marker would have wanted, but the question of why people believed, why billions of people across 3 centuries committed their lives to a faith built on a manufactured martyr and a signal that was never what it claimed to be. That question has a real answer, an uncomfortable one, and it is the thing the final chapter is about, because understanding why people believe the marker is saving them turns out to require understanding something about how the human mind works under conditions of fear, grief, and the specific kind of hope that gets strongest exactly when the evidence against it is clearest. And that might be the most disturbing thing this franchise has ever put forward. Chapter 9, Make Us Whole. The phrase runs through the entire Dead Space franchise like a wire connecting every separate disaster to a single source. People scratch it into walls in their final moments before the transformation takes hold. They whisper it while the dementia is still lucid enough to produce language. It shows up in Unitology's most common prayers, in the liturgical language of billions of believers who never knew what it actually described. It appears in the hallucinations of people who have been close enough to a marker, long enough for the signal to root itself in their specific grief. It gets attributed to the marker itself, treated as the artifact's central promise, the distilled message that every broadcast the marker has ever sent eventually reduces to, make us whole. For 300 years, the Church of Unitology interpreted that phrase as an invitation, a promise of spiritual merger, the end of individual isolation, the absorption of all human consciousness into something so vast and permanent that the ordinary fear of death would become irrelevant inside it. Unitologists who heard the signal and felt the pull it creates towards something undefined and enormous understood that pull as the beginning of the transcendence the phrase described. They were being called toward completion. The marker was offering to finish what mortality had left unfinished in them. Dead Space 3 eventually reveals where the phrase actually originates. The Tau Volantis moon, incomplete and frozen on the surface of a dead alien world for thousands of years, had been broadcasting through every marker in the network for the entire duration of its stasis. The signal that reached human populations in the 23rd century, the signal that generated Unitology and shaped the direction of 300 years of human civilization and research and conflict, was the incomplete moon trying to communicate its own condition, its own need, its own interrupted and unfinished state. Make Us Whole was not an offer extended to humanity. It was a description of what the moon itself was missing. The incomplete moon had not finished forming. The Convergence Event that would have produced it had been stopped by the alien machine before the final stage was reached, before the biological mass was fully incorporated, and the moon could join the broader Brethren network as a completed entity. For thousands of years it had existed in this partial state, aware in whatever way a Brethren moon is capable of awareness. Reaching through every marker it could still influence for something that would come to Tau Volantis and remove the obstacle keeping it from completing what had been started. Every human being who ever heard that signal and interpreted it as an invitation was receiving a distress call from something that had been stranded longer than human civilization had existed. This fact, once understood, recontextualizes every individual experience of the marker signal across the entire franchise. The Unitologist on Aegis VII who preached about the marker preparing the colonists for ascension was not receiving a divine communication. The colonists who felt inexplicable pulls toward meaning and the sensation that their ordinary lives no longer mattered were not being spiritually awakened. Isaac Clarke, guided by the face of a dead woman through 2 consecutive disasters, was not receiving guidance from someone who loved him. Every one of them was picking up the signal from something frozen in the dark, above a planet they had never heard of, trying desperately to get someone to go there and turn off the machine that was keeping it in pieces. The personalization of that signal is worth examining carefully because it is the part of the marker's mechanics that produces the most genuine unease when you understand what it actually is. The hallucinations the marker generates are not random intrusions of the subconscious. They are targeted. The marker's signal reaches a compatible human brain and, through whatever mechanism the franchise leaves deliberately unexplained, identifies the specific emotional content that will make that person most cooperative. The dead loved one appears wearing the exact face that person remembers. The hallucination speaks in patterns consistent with how that person actually communicated. The messages delivered feel like something that person would genuinely say, which is what makes the experience so difficult to dismiss even when the rational mind knows it cannot be real. The marker is doing something with grief specifically. Not because grief is the only emotional state it can access, but because grief is among the most reliable vulnerabilities across the widest possible range of people. Research on how loss affects the decision-making process has found consistently that people in acute grief are more open to explanatory systems that promise to restore what was taken. The threshold for belief in something ordinarily implausible drops significantly when what is being offered addresses an absence that nothing else has managed to fill. Everyone has lost someone. Everyone carries the specific shape of an absence that ordinary experience has not found a way to close. The marker found this in Isaac Clarke and used Nicole's face as the precise lever for keeping him cooperative through 2 games worth of events where cooperation served the marker's purposes. The warmth in that hallucination's expression was not the marker empathizing with his pain, it was the marker finding the right frequency. Consider what this reveals about the broader population affected by the signal across the franchise. The colonists on Aegis VII who were pulled toward dementia, the researchers in the 21st century who built the first red markers believing they were working toward an energy solution, the billions of Unitology members who organized their lives around convergence as a spiritual promise, each of them was encountering the same personalized targeting mechanism applied at different scales and intensities. Most of the ordinary Unitology membership never experienced the marker signal directly. They encountered the religion that had been built from the signal's effects on specific people in specific circumstances 300 years earlier, but the doctrine they practiced was itself a processed version of what the signal had communicated to Michael Altman, the man who had been close enough to the black marker, long enough to cross a threshold that reshaped how they understood existence. The religion was the signal's downstream effect, filtered through 3 centuries of institutional development, stripped of the context that would have made its origins recognizable. By the time an ordinary person joined Unitology in the 26th century, they were not joining a cult formed around an alien artifact's manipulation of one grieving and unstable researcher. They were joining the largest, most established religious institution in human civilization, with billions of fellow believers, a sophisticated theology, a rich cultural tradition, and a promise of transcendence that addressed genuine fears about mortality and meaning. The signal had not reached them directly. Their experience of the marker was entirely mediated through the community, the rituals, and the doctrinal framework that had been built on top of what the signal had originally produced. This is how the marker's initial manipulation sustained itself for 3 centuries without requiring any subsequent direct contact with the artifact. The religion was the mechanism. The believers were the signal's second-generation instruments. And here is the part of this that has the most uncomfortable implications for the question this video is really asking. The marker's signal does not become less effective on more intelligent minds. Research on how belief systems take hold and persist has found something that runs counter to intuitive expectation. The more sophisticated a person's cognitive architecture, the more capable that architecture is of constructing internally consistent frameworks that protect a belief from contradictory evidence. Less complex processing is more easily disrupted by direct contradiction. More complex processing builds internal systems that can accommodate contradictory data without allowing it to destabilize the core belief. This is not unique to any particular culture or ideology. It is a feature of how advanced reasoning works. The same cognitive sophistication that allows a person to understand complex systems also allows that person to generate complex reasons for why apparent evidence against a belief does not actually undermine it. The marker specifically targets the more sophisticated minds. The compatible brains that receive blueprints instead of madness are the brains that can sustain the most elaborate internal frameworks. They are better equipped to receive and hold the marker's encoding. They are also better equipped to rationalize continued cooperation with the marker's agenda when the evidence suggests that cooperation is harmful. The people who served the marker most completely were not the ones who couldn't think their way through what was happening to them. They were the ones who could think their way through anything, and who used that capability to build increasingly elaborate reasons for why continuing to cooperate was correct and justified. Tiedemann's team at Project Telomere did not consist of stupid people. They had access to the full history of every previous marker disaster. They had the research from the Chicxulub facility, from the original Aegis VII colony, from the Ishimura. They had the data from Titan Station. They understood at an institutional level what markers do to human populations, and they built the Site-12 marker anyway, aboard the Sprawl, a civilian station housing tens of thousands of people, because the intelligence that allowed them to understand the risk was the same intelligence that generated the reasoning framework justifying it. That is not an accident of character. That is the marker selecting correctly. If you are still with this, the next chapter is where the final shape of the answer becomes visible, because there is one more element to what the marker system is actually doing. One more implication the franchise works toward across its full runtime. And it is the thing that makes the title question hurt more when you understand it than it does when you first ask it. Chapter 10, The Mind It Needs. It doesn't start with the monsters. The colonists on Aegis VII, who began deteriorating weeks before the first necromorph surfaced, were not seeing things, at least not yet. Their earliest symptoms were far quieter than that: a growing difficulty sleeping, a creeping sense that the things they had spent years caring about had started to feel hollow, a weight on the day that they could not point to or explain, the kind that makes a person wonder, privately and without telling anyone, whether something has changed in them, or whether the world has always been this dim and they simply didn't notice before. These are symptoms the marker's signal produces in its earliest phase. The lore documents them specifically: acute depression, insomnia, personality shifts that start subtle enough to be mistaken for ordinary stress. The signal is working during this period. It is doing exactly what it is designed to do, and the people experiencing it have no reason to connect what they are feeling to an alien artifact buried beneath the ground, because nothing about what they are feeling is dramatic enough to demand that kind of explanation. The most effective phase of marker-induced dementia is the phase that doesn't look like dementia at all. One piece of recovered audio from within the franchise captures this precisely. The observation is made by someone who understands the signal's mechanics in ways most people in that world never do. The most insidious effect, the recording notes, is when the signal takes hold without any outward sign of madness. The person affected believes they are following their own natural compulsions, and they will not realize the manipulation until the plan they've been guided toward has already been carried out. That is the horror the Marker franchise is really exploring, not the monsters. The period before the monsters, when the most dangerous thing happening is invisible to the person it is happening to. This chapter is about why that specific kind of horror is the hardest to shake, and why the psychological design of the Marker maps onto fears that exist in people who have never played a Dead Space game and never will. Horror research has consistently found a distinction between two categories of fear that feel similar from the outside but operate through entirely different mechanisms. The first category is fear of an external threat, a predator, a violent person, an environmental danger. The brain handles this category through a well-practiced biological pathway: adrenaline, narrowed attention, the fight-or-flight response. These responses are uncomfortable, sometimes severely so, but they are oriented. The fear has a direction. There is a thing out there, and the task is to get away from it or neutralize it. The discomfort has a shape that the mind can work with. The second category is fear of internal disruption, the loss of the ability to trust one's own perceptions, the inability to distinguish what is real from what the mind is generating. Conditions that affect cognitive function, such as dementia and psychosis, generate this kind of fear in a different way because the threat is not outside the self. The threat is the self, or more precisely, it is the apparatus the person uses to evaluate everything else, beginning to malfunction. Research into how people experience and respond to neurodegenerative conditions has found that the fear they produce is qualitatively different from the fear produced by physical illness. Physical illness can be devastating, and its consequences can be extreme. Cognitive disruption, however, threatens something that people experience as more fundamental than the body, the self. The part of a person that thinks, evaluates, remembers, decides, the part that makes a person recognizable to themselves. Losing that piece is not experienced as a kind of dying. It is experienced as something harder to name, the dissolution of the thing that would even register the dying. The marker begins there, before the necromorphs, before the hallucinations, in the quiet erosion of the confidence a person has in the reliability of their own mind. By the time the hallucinations arrive, that confidence has already been substantially damaged. The hallucinations themselves are where the franchise's horror psychology becomes genuinely sophisticated, because the marker does not produce generic intrusions. It does not simply generate noise, or shapes, or voices pulled from nowhere. Research into how the mind produces hallucinations, across a range of conditions from grief to psychosis to severe sleep deprivation, has found that the content of hallucinations is never truly random. The mind assembles hallucinations from material it already contains, the people who appear, the voices that speak, the scenarios that unfold, are all derived from the person's existing memories, relationships, and emotional landscape. The marker exploits this. Both Isaac Clarke and John Carver, the two primary protagonists across the franchise's later games, hallucinate the people they have lost. For Isaac, the hallucination wears Nicole's face. For Carver, it takes the form of his dead wife and son, appearing at specific moments in ways that are shaped by the particular guilt and grief he carries. The details are different for each of them because the signal draws on the specific content of each person's mind, rather than broadcasting a uniform image to everyone who encounters it. This is a level of psychological targeting that goes beyond what a conventional horror antagonist can deliver. A monster in the traditional sense is external. It approaches from outside. Its threat is physical, and its form is fixed. The most terrifying thing it can do is get close enough to touch you. The marker gets closer than that. It reaches inside the specific shape of your loss and constructs something from it. It finds the person whose absence you have never fully adjusted to, whose voice you still sometimes hear at the edge of sleep, whose particular way of saying your name is stored so deeply in your brain that you could not deliberately forget it if you tried, and it puts that face in front of you wearing the expression that would make you follow it anywhere. Research into grief has documented a phenomenon that tends to be underrepresented in public discussions of bereavement. A significant proportion of people who have lost someone they were deeply attached to report experiences of that person's continued presence in the period following the death. Hearing a familiar voice from an adjacent room, catching a glimpse of someone familiar in peripheral vision, a vivid sense, momentarily indistinguishable from real perception, that the person is still there. These experiences are not pathological in the context of grief. They represent the brain doing something understandable. It has organized significant portions of its processing around the patterns of another person, and those patterns continue to generate output even after the person who produced them is gone. The marker does not manufacture this vulnerability in Isaac Clarke. It finds the vulnerability already present and amplifies it with extraordinary precision. Nicole Brennan's death had not been processed by Isaac at the time he boards the Ishimura. He had her final message. He had the knowledge, somewhere beneath the grief, that it described something final, and he had continued doing what unprocessed loss often compels people to do, which is to keep moving, keep functioning, keep arriving at the next task, as a way of staying ahead of the full weight of what has happened. The signal finds him in exactly this state. The hallucination it generates does not appear as something obviously false. It appears as something that his brain is already partly producing on its own. Familiar, specific, calibrated to the exact emotional register of someone he knew. The horror of the Nicole hallucination is not that it looks like a monster dressed in a person's clothing. The horror is that it looks like her. Research on the uncanny valley phenomenon, the specific discomfort produced by representations of human beings that are almost right but wrong in precise ways, has found that the wrongness is most disturbing when it is subtle, rather than obvious. A clearly artificial figure does not trigger the same response as one that falls just short of complete believability. The gap between almost human and actually human is where the deepest unease lives, because the brain is working to categorize what it's encountering and failing, being pulled between recognition and wrongness without being able to resolve the tension in either direction. The Nicole hallucination in the franchise is written and designed to exist in that gap. Its behavior is consistent with Nicole's patterns in ways that make dismissal difficult. Its inconsistencies appear at specific moments, revealing the manipulation underneath, then retreating again before the full picture solidifies. The experience for Isaac is not one of encountering something obviously false. It is one of repeatedly almost understanding that something is wrong, then being pulled back by the next moment of apparent authenticity. Living inside that uncertainty is the sustained psychological experience the marker is designed to produce. This connects to something the franchise understands about why cosmic horror as a category lands differently in the body than conventional horror. The monster in a creature feature has an agenda that can be understood, even if only as the agenda of hunger or territory or survival. The monster makes choices in response to the protagonist's choices. The confrontation has a grammar to it, a set of rules the monster operates within, and understanding those rules gives the person confronting the monster a framework for response. The marker network does not have an agenda in the sense that implies a decision maker. Research on what makes ambiguous threats more disturbing than identifiable ones has found that the ability to attribute intention to a threat produces a paradoxical stabilizing effect. If the threat wants something, it can theoretically be negotiated with, appealed to, or understood well enough to be outmaneuvered. Threats that do not want anything, that are simply processes running according to their design, without any consciousness behind the design that could be reached, produce a different category of dread. The strategies a person would normally bring to a dangerous situation, understanding the opponent's motivation, finding the leverage point, making the thing see you as more useful alive than dead, have no purchase on something operating without motivation at all. The Brethren Moon Network is the franchise's fullest expression of this. The signal is not the will of something that desires human death. The signal is the output of a self-propagating biological process that uses intelligent civilizations as components. There is nothing at the center of it that could hear an appeal. There is no face behind the structure that could be persuaded to make an exception. The people who spent 300 years believing that the marker was a god were not simply wrong about the marker's intentions. They were wrong about whether the marker has intentions at all, in any sense that maps onto what the word normally means. That is the specific cognitive horror the franchise builds toward across its full run, and it is the horror that sits in a different place than physical danger. The body knows how to be afraid of something that might kill it. There are biological systems for that, refined across millions of years of evolution. What the body does not have a prepared system for is the revelation that the thing guiding it has been something other than itself for longer than it realized, and that the distinction between its own cognition and the signal's influence cannot be cleanly drawn. The research log recovered from within the marker program during the events of the franchise's later games states it clearly. The people working in proximity to the artifacts believe they are acting on their own conclusions. The rationalizations they produce for continuing the program feel, from inside, like their own reasoning. The possibility that those rationalizations were placed there, that the confidence they feel in their own judgment is itself part of the signal's effect, is something that cannot be definitively ruled out from inside the experience. This is the part of marker dementia that the franchise describes as most insidious. not the stage where the person is visibly breaking down. The stage where everything feels normal, where the person is going to work and making decisions and interacting with colleagues and believing completely that they are doing so from a position of autonomous judgment, and they are not. Research on how manipulation operates at the systemic level, in institutions, in high control groups, in situations where a person's decision-making environment has been shaped by external forces they are not aware of, has found that the most effective manipulation is the kind that makes itself feel like the target's own thinking. The target is not being told what to believe. They are being given the conditions under which they will arrive at the desired belief through what feels like their own reasoning process. The manipulation is laundered through the person's own cognition until it feels indistinguishable from genuine conclusion. The marker does this at a biological level, with a precision that no human institution has ever matched. Now consider what this means for the experience of watching or listening to content about the Dead Space franchise in the specific context this channel creates. The late-night setting is not incidental. The dimmed lights, the comfortable position, the particular kind of attention that comes with being physically at rest while the mind is actively engaged, these conditions are themselves a form of openness. The defenses that get raised in ordinary social situations, the skepticism, the maintained distance, the part of the mind that evaluates incoming information for whether it should be taken seriously, are quieter in this context. The fear this franchise generates in that setting is not the fear of a thing coming to get you. It is the more specific fear of recognizing something. Research into why horror as a genre maintains its appeal despite, or possibly because of, the genuine distress it produces has identified a consistent dynamic. People seek out horror content partly as a safe container for fears they already carry. The fictional frame provides enough distance that the fear can be experienced and examined without requiring the person to actually be in danger. The content functions as a kind of controlled exposure, allowing the viewer to sit with the fear, turn it over, understand its shape, in a context where they are not at risk. The fears that Dead Space generates work this way for the people who respond to them most strongly. The fear of losing the thread of your own mind. The fear that the voice you most trust is not what you believe it to be. The fear that the thing guiding you towards something important might be guiding you towards something else entirely without your knowledge or consent. The fear that the institutions you have trusted to manage dangerous things have rationalized themselves past the point where they could manage anything. These are not fears born from the game. The game found them where they already lived. The marker's signal targets the parts of human psychology that are not weaknesses. The capacity to love someone enough that losing them leaves a shape nothing else quite fills. The need for meaning strong enough to organize a life around. The trust that goes to institutions and belief systems capable of containing the chaos that individual lives cannot contain alone. The tendency of sophisticated reasoning to generate increasingly elaborate justifications for positions already held, because the mind is very good at making its existing conclusions feel like its freshest thinking. The marker does not create these qualities. They were there before it arrived. They are what makes humanity, in the franchise's terms, such a good host. The horror of the red marker is ultimately the horror of discovering that the things most worth preserving in yourself are the things a sufficiently patient and well-designed system can use as the mechanism of your cooperation. That is the insight the franchise is working toward across its full runtime, and it is why the question of whether the marker is trying to save humanity lands so differently once you understand what the marker actually is, because the question itself demonstrates the mechanism. Asking whether something that uses you wants to save you is a question shaped by the hope that the answer might be yes, and that hope is exactly where the signal already lives. Chapter 11, The Answer No One Wants. The question this video started with was direct. Is the red marker actually trying to save humanity? Everything covered across the previous chapters gets us to the point where that question can be answered clearly, and the answer, fully examined, is that the question was never the right shape to begin with. The marker does not try to save humanity. The marker does not try to destroy humanity. Both of those framings assume the marker relates to human beings the way an agent might. as either something to be protected or something to be eliminated. The marker's actual relationship to humanity is neither category. It is something harder to place emotionally, which is why the franchise's horror never resolves into a shape that feels clean. The marker needs humanity, in a specific, precise, and temporary sense. It needs minds capable of understanding and replicating the signal. It needs institutions capable of carrying copies of the artifact to new locations. It needs the particular kind of civilizational expansion that intelligent species are uniquely capable of providing. The spread across multiple worlds that gives the marker simultaneous access to multiple populations at once. Every human being across the full 3-game narrative who served any of those functions was being used by a system that was using them the way any sufficiently complex process uses its components. When a component ceased to be useful, the system's relationship to that component changed accordingly. Isaac Clarke was kept alive through events that killed everyone around him, not because the marker valued him as a person. He was the most functional marker architect the signal had identified in 200 years. His brain held a complete and precise imprint of the construction data, more complete than any other imprint the marker had managed to place in a human mind during that period. Keeping him alive was the correct outcome for the system's purposes. His survival was not luck or heroism in the marker's terms. It was quality control. When he refused convergence on Titan Station, the system registered the outcome and adapted. It activated other architects, spread the signal further through the EarthGov replication program, located the next population of compatible minds, and continued building toward the same outcome through whatever paths remained open. The marker does not grieve the loss of one specific instrument, it adjusts. This is a different kind of villain than the horror genre usually offers, and it is worth naming that difference directly because it explains why the franchise's lore lands differently from most survival horror stories. A conventional horror antagonist has intention. It wants something. The wanting gives it a kind of personhood that allows for the possibility of an appeal, a negotiation, a clever refusal that the monster has to respond to because it is, at some level, engaging with you as something other than raw material. The most effective horror films and games tend to work in this space. The monster notices you. The monster chooses you. The monster wants something from you, specifically. The marker does not choose Isaac Clarke the way a predator chooses prey. It identifies him the way a system identifies the component with the highest utility rating. His survival, his suffering, his refusal, his eventual success at destroying a brethren moon. All of these register in the same way that any environmental variable registers in a sufficiently complex biological process. The system notes the outcome and calculates the next available path. There is no one to appeal to inside that system. There is no decision maker who could be persuaded. There is no consciousness at the center of it that cares whether humanity lives or dies, because the system does not have a relationship to outcomes the way conscious agents do. It has a process. The process runs. The components that serve the process are preserved while they are useful. Everything else is incorporated into the outcome. This is the design detail that makes Dead Space different from most cosmic horror. Lovecraftian horror, the tradition the franchise draws from most heavily in its DNA, often centers on entities that are indifferent to humanity in a specific emotional sense. The Great Old Ones and similar figures in that tradition are too vast to care about individual humans the way a person might care about an individual ant, but they have inner lives. They have purposes and preferences and states that could theoretically be described as desire. The Brethren Moon Network does not map cleanly onto that tradition. The moons may have something like awareness. The franchise confirms they can communicate with each other and with Isaac in ways that suggest a kind of intelligence, but the structure they operate within, the self-propagating galactic cycle of black marker deployment, civilization cultivation, necromorph accumulation, and convergence, does not require that intelligence to have preference or intention in any meaningful sense. A forest fire has behavior. It expands. It consumes. It creates the conditions for its own propagation. None of that requires the forest fire to want anything. The marker network functions with the same relentless structural momentum. And the horror of it is the horror of confronting a process that is working perfectly according to its design, while everything you would recognize as valuable is consumed by it. Now think about what that means for every person in the franchise who dedicated their life to the belief that the marker was offering something real. The Unitologist who gave up their savings to the church because the promise of transcendence made the fear of death bearable. The researcher who spent years trying to make the marker's energy output safe for civilian use because the resource crisis was real and the need was genuine. The soldier who followed orders into a marker research facility because the institution they served had determined that the risk was manageable. The patient who woke up in a psychiatric ward with no memory of the previous 3 years and no understanding of what had been done to their mind, while they were kept compliant with memory suppressants. None of these people made their choices from a position of stupidity or moral failure. They made them from within the specific limitations of what was available to know at the time they made them, surrounded by institutions and belief systems that were themselves the downstream products of the marker's earlier influence. The marker had, in a meaningful sense, arranged the conditions of its own operation. Every institution that should have stopped it became instead one of the mechanisms through which it spread. The government that discovered the black marker covered it up and eventually used the data to build red markers. The religion built around the man who first discovered the black marker spent 3 centuries working to spread red markers to every populated system in human space. The research program designed to harness marker energy safely ended up constructing the largest marker humanity had ever built in the most densely populated civilian station available. Everything that could have been a safeguard became a conduit. This is where the franchise's deepest analysis of institutional behavior lives. The problem was never that the individuals inside these systems were uniquely corrupt or uniquely foolish. The problem was that each system had a specific set of pressures and incentives that made cooperation with the markers process the most rational available choice at every individual decision point. No one in EarthGov sat down and decided to doom humanity. They decided step by step that the resource crisis was real, that the previous failures had been the result of insufficient precautions, that their program was more careful than the ones before it, and that the cost of stopping was greater than the cost of continuing. Research on how organizations continue harmful practices long after evidence of harm has accumulated has found this pattern repeatedly. Each individual decision in the sequence is defensible within the framework available at the moment it is made. The cumulative outcome of a chain of defensible individual decisions can be catastrophic in a way that no single decision along the chain would predict. The gap between how each step looks from inside the process and how the full sequence looks from outside, it is the gap where institutional catastrophe consistently lives. The marker system had been running long enough across enough civilizations to have learned, in whatever functional sense a process can learn, exactly how to position itself within that gap. The alien civilization on Tau Volantis understood this at a level humanity never reached collectively. Their response was not an attempt to use the marker more safely, extract its energy without triggering the outbreak, or build institutions robust enough to manage the signal. Their response was a machine designed to physically halt a process that could not be argued out of completing itself. They did not try to negotiate with the system. They built something capable of stopping it regardless of the system's own objectives. Whether they survived making that choice, the franchise leaves open. Their fate is not confirmed in the games. What remains of their civilization is the ruins beneath Tau Volantis' ice, the markers they built before they understood what the markers were doing, and the machine that has been running without them for longer than human history. The distance between that outcome and humanity's position at the end of the franchise is the emotional center of everything Dead Space has been building toward. The alien race managed to freeze the process. Whether they survived freezing it is unknown. Humanity, 3 games into confronting the same sequence, ends with a necromorph outbreak confirmed on Earth, and a network of operational Brethren moons converging on the last confirmed location of human life. Isaac Clarke is adrift above a dying planet with no confirmed plan. The franchise ends there. That ending is not nihilism exactly. Isaac is still alive. John Carver is still alive. The machine on Tau Volantis had worked for thousands of years before Danik turned it off. The possibility that someone could build something similar, that the knowledge of what the alien civilization accomplished could be applied by the two people who know more about the marker system than any other living human beings, is not closed off by anything the games confirm. It is simply not given to us. And the reason that absence is the right choice is the same reason the question in this video's title is the right question to ask, while leaving part of the answer in the listener's hands. The marker's most consistent target, across every civilization it has ever touched, is the part of intelligent minds that cannot tolerate an open question. The part that fills uncertainty with whatever shape of hope is most available. The part that interprets ambiguity as invitation. 300 years of unitology. Research programs that continued past every warning sign because stopping was harder to justify than continuing. Individual survivors who kept going because the alternative was accepting that everything they had lost was simply gone. The marker is most effective on minds that need an answer badly enough to accept the first one that fits. So the question this video ends on is not whether the red marker is trying to save humanity. That answer is clear. It is using humanity, the same way it uses every civilization complex enough to find it, as material for a process whose conclusion is not salvation in any sense the word normally carries. The question worth sitting with is this: if the marker signal specifically exploits the part of the mind that needs meaning in the face of loss, and if that need is genuine and universal, and not a weakness but a consequence of being conscious enough to understand impermanence, then what does resistance to the marker actually look like? Isaac Clarke's answer was to refuse the hallucination that wore the face of someone he loved, even knowing how much he wanted it to be real. To choose the grief of the loss over the relief the signal was offering, because the relief came at a cost he would not pay. That is not a comfortable answer. Choosing the grief over the illusion is harder than the franchise makes it look in the final moments of Dead Space 2. But it is the only answer the lore supports as genuinely resistant. Everything else, every institution, every belief system, every individual who heard the signal and called it God, or called it progress, or called it a manageable risk, was moving in the direction the marker had already mapped for them. The red marker is not trying to save humanity. It is offering humanity exactly what it needs to believe, while walking it carefully, patiently, and with great precision toward something else entirely. Whether that distinction is legible before it is too late is the question the franchise poses without answering.